Hey guys, it's Alex the Real Mr. Robinson. Welcome back to my chronological recap of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We're at part 9, and this is Thor the Dark World, which is the only MCU movie that I have the least emotional investment in. For the longest time, this has always been my least favorite Marvel movie. I remember seeing it back then in the theaters, and I gave it a positive review. I still said, worth seeing in your lifetime, but that was seriously a moment where I was like, yeah, I was just on that Marvel high. I didn't want to say anything bad about my favorite series. I saw it again in prep for Avengers Age of Ultron and liked it a little more, but just didn't find it all that engaging. And I feel the exact same about this movie here, although now I think this isn't as bad as Iron Man 2. And Thor the Dark World really isn't that bad of a movie. It's just okay. It's just so bland in how okay it is. So Kenneth Branagh did not direct this movie. You could tell because it has a very different style to it. For one, no Dutch angles. And for two, the production design for Asgard and just the lighting overall kind of resembles Game of Thrones. I mean, the movie was directed by Alan Taylor, who had directed a couple episodes of Game of Thrones. So I don't blame them for replicating that very look for Thor, because if there's any character that they've introduced so far that fits that Game of Thrones aesthetic, it's Thor. And speaking of Thor himself, Chris Hemsworth is still as charming as ever. There are slight hints in this movie where you start to see that Thor that we love in Ragnarok and Infinity War. Again, they're very slight, but when he first comes into the movie, there's this big battle in another one of the 9 realms. He basically saves Sif at the very last minute, and Sif says, "I've got this completely under control," and Thor responds with, "Is that why everything's on fire?" And there are a couple of other lines in this movie that aren't as Shakespearean as you'd expect, so there's a hint of that Thor that we would end up loving later on. But again, it's not a whole lot. And Thor as a character, while Chris Hemsworth is still very charming, he ultimately doesn't have that much to do in this movie. He doesn't really go through any arcs. If anything, the movie is actually more about Loki. Because Tom Hiddleston worked so well in the Avengers, they decided to give Loki a lot more. And understandable, we have more sympathy for Loki than we do Thor. The desperation for Thor to bring Loki in to help him save the world is because their mother passed away and he just wants vengeance against Malekith, the villain. Get to him a little later. So there's a lot more going on with him than there is Thor, but this isn't supposed to be Loki's movie. This is supposed to be Thor's. I know we're getting that Disney Plus series with Loki starring Tom Hiddleston, so I can't wait to see them actually utilize him more in that. But here, again, he's got more to do, but this isn't his movie. Now let's actually get into the actual villain of the movie, Malekith the Dark Elf, played by Christopher Eccleston. He's barely a villain. I will say this, that he's actually a real dark elf instead of Ben Kingsley's Mandarin being fake, but this character is just so undefined. You heard me rant about Mickey Rourke as Ivan Vanko in Iron Man 2, but at least that character had a motivation. Malekith's motivation in this movie is to take the ether and basically make the world dark again. Okay, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What do you mean by make the world dark again? Like, just end the world? Take out the sun to where it's always nighttime? There's no real defining explanation for Malekith's motivation. And yeah, this is just the worst villain in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because he's so undefined and so bland. And even outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I've considered him to be the worst comic book movie villain out there. But ever since Justice League came out, I think we have a new champion for that. Now, the supporting characters in this movie are pretty much the same as in the last movie, but lesser. They really had a missed opportunity with Sif and the Warriors 3 in this movie. Or I guess Warriors 2, because one of them is off in another realm the entire movie. This should have been sort of like a Lord of the Rings type quest, where Thor, Loki, and Sif and the Warriors 3 have to take Jane Foster, who's been infected by the ether, and try to hunt down Malekith and get the ether out of her to destroy it. That could have been really fun, but they're just reduced to being straight out supporting characters, to the point where I really forget their names. I mean, when Screen Junkies did their honest trailer for Thor Ragnarok, they weren't kidding when you forget the names of the Warriors 3. Although I will say in this movie, for one of the Warriors 3, there is a recasting. Frandal, here he's played by Zachary Levi, and it's very funny for me to review this movie the same week Shazam comes out, which has Zachary Levi in the lead role. So that's ironic right there. But they really wasted an opportunity with these characters. And with Anthony Hopkins as Odin, he just seems so lifeless and bored throughout this whole movie. And I'd blame that more on Alan Taylor than anything, because this movie went through a lot of production troubles before it even got off the ground. At one point, Patty Jenkins was hired to direct the movie, but then she left, and just like with Zachary Levi, went over to DC to do Wonder Woman. So with all the production troubles of this movie, it had the potential to just not be great. And even during and afterwards, Alan Taylor didn't really talk about this movie a whole lot. He doesn't really like it. And watching this movie, I'm like, man, Marvel kind of did Alan Taylor wrong. They should have just let him make the movie and not interfered a whole lot. But then watching Terminator Genisys, I was like, oh, this changes everything, because now I'm under the impression that Alan Taylor is not a good director at all, and Marvel was doing everything they could to possibly save the production. At least that's how I look at it, because I hate Terminator Genisys. And even then, with him directing some really good episodes of Game of Thrones, all the Game of Thrones episodes really kind of feel the same, so it's really hard to distinguish what he actually brought to the table. But I blame his lackluster direction on Anthony Hopkins just seeming lifeless in this movie. You can tell the level of emotion that Odin has in the first Thor movie, because Kenneth Branagh had a very Shakespearean way of directing it. And even when we get to Thor Ragnarok later on, Taika Waititi knew how to handle Odin. So there's not much to this character, and Rene Russo is back in this movie as the Queen of Asgard, Frigga, who is inevitably killed in this movie trying to protect Jane Foster. And it actually leads into the best scene of the movie. And that's not me giving this a backhanded compliment. When rewatching this movie, Frigga's funeral is actually very well done. It's beautiful, it's well directed, the score is great. And when we see Loki hear the news that his mother had passed away, even though she's not his biological mother, we see his devastation, and it's effective. So if there's anything that makes this movie at least better than Iron Man 2, it's Frigga's death scene. That's very well done. Now let's talk about the supporting characters on Earth. This is exactly what I get for giving Darcy a pass in the last movie. I gave her a pass. Evil flourishes when good men do nothing, and with Darcy in the first Thor, I gave it a pass, I did nothing, and now she has become the most irritating character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I have nothing against Kat Dennings at all. This is just the way that she's directed, the way she's written, so she's just making do with what she's given. But man, this movie really did open my eyes to all the criticisms people had about Darcy in the first Thor, because I'll still stand by the first Thor movie. I think she's utilized very well and she's funny, but she's downright annoying in this movie. In fact, a lot of the humor in this movie falls flat. There are a lot of attempts to replicate the humor in the first Avengers movie in this one. I mean, Joss Whedon did come on board to do a few uncredited rewrites or script revisions, so that kind of explains it, but if there's any negative repercussions from the Avengers, it's that both Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World tried to replicate the humor of the Avengers. And where I think Iron Man 3 succeeded mostly because of Shane Black's humor, Thor the Dark World does not work at all. There are a few moments that made me laugh. There are a few lines here and there. The funniest moment in the movie for me is when Thor and Jane Foster arrive on Earth at Jane's London apartment, and Thor just hangs up Mjolnir on a coat rack. That had me laughing hard, and every time I watch this movie, that moment makes me laugh. Speaking of Jane Foster, I have nothing against the character, and I actually like that she's utilized in this movie a little more, but once again, the romance in this movie just doesn't really amount to much. It's kind of forced. The reason Jane just has a fondness for Thor is because he's so good looking, and there's not much else beyond that. I do like the attempt to give Jane Foster a lot more to do, and I think Natalie Portman does a really good job with what she's given, but there's just not a whole lot to this character. The action's okay, it's not really exciting, it actually kind of feels anticlimactic. The big finale of the movie is rather confusing. Throughout the whole movie they talk about how the 9 realms are converging and how there are portals that lead to other places or other dimensions or other worlds. It's so confusing. Every time I've watched this movie, I still can't understand anything that's being said. I mean, maybe it's just so weird we're not supposed to get it, but the fact that this movie tries so hard to explain how the convergence works, it just doesn't work. This movie is just so bland. It's almost fascinating how bland this movie is. Now, the big question in the movie is that the convergence is happening with Earth. There's a dark elf taking what is ultimately revealed to be an Infinity Stone to basically bring the world into eternal darkness, whatever that means, and no one ever calls the Avengers. Now, I can understand that, because Malekith is not really that big of a threat to really warrant the Avengers helping out, and there are only a few Dark Elves. Thor can handle all these people himself, and he eventually does, so there's no real reason to call the Avengers, especially considering that they're off doing their own things. And that's also the good thing about Iron Man 3, is that it addressed why the Avengers weren't called in, because the whole Mandarin deal was not superhero business, it's American business, it's terrorists. So yeah, I just don't have much else to say about Thor the Dark World. It's not bad, but it's just so average. The main character, while charming, is not very interesting. It focuses more on his brother than it should him. The humor is dialed up to a point where it's just almost awkward to watch. Like, most of the jokes don't work at all. The villain sucks. It's very anticlimactic. It's just very confusing. The only thing that really makes Thor the Dark World worthy of being in a conversation is that it officially set up the notion of Infinity Stones. I'll get back to that little aspect in a bit, but in terms of my rating, watch at your own risk. I like this much better than Iron Man 2 because Iron Man 2 downright irritated me. And while this movie is just kind of lackluster and average, I'd rather just go with an average movie than a movie that irritates me, because with a movie that irritates me, I just want it to end soon. With a movie that's just boring or average, I'm just like, okay, I can sit through this because I'm not in any pain watching it. As for the Stan Lee cameo, he's just playing an old man in a mental hospital that happens to have Dr. Eric Selvig as well. And for context's sake, Eric Selvig, played again by Stellan Skarsgård, was placed in this mental hospital after he was caught streaking around Stonehenge nude. If you've never seen Thor the Dark World, just don't ask. Don't ask questions about that. But he's talking to a bunch of other patients about the convergence, and he's using two shoes as props. And at the end of the session, he says, "Any questions?" And Stan Lee just says, "Yeah, can I have my shoe back?" Now, in terms of the two stingers, the first stinger is actually a reason why Thor the Dark World's worth mentioning in a conversation. Because Lady Sif and Volstagg visit the Collector on Nowhere, who we would eventually see in Guardians of the Galaxy, and give him the ether. And the Collector asks, "Why don't you keep the ether with you in Asgard?" And Volstagg just says that the Tesseract is already there, and it's not wise to keep two Infinity Stones together. Which I guess makes sense, because if Odin's treasure room is being raided, the last thing you'd want is for somebody to get their hands on two Infinity Stones. So the two Asgardians basically leave the Collector, and as they turn around the corner, the Collector just says, "1 down, 5 to go." As for the end credit stinger, it's really not worth it. Basically, Thor returns to Earth after he denies the throne by Odin, aka Loki disguised as Odin, reunites with Jane Foster, they have a very awkward kiss, and then there's a random frost giant monster running around London. That's it. So yeah, that's Thor the Dark World, and even when I saw this movie in the theaters, me trying to convince myself that this movie was better than it actually was, I was just like, yeah, I might be giving up on the MCU. I mean, I'll still always have Phase 1 and that massive, incredible lead up to the Avengers, but everything else I could probably do without. But then Marvel came in and said, "Oh, you're giving up on the Avengers? Well, what if we gave you this?" Yes, next time we're going to be talking about one of my favorite movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I cannot wait to revisit this movie. So now I want to hear what you guys think about Thor the Dark World. When you first saw it in the theaters, did you actually like it? Is it just average to you? Do you hate this movie? Let me know. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and of course leave a comment. Don't forget to support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.